Professor Dr. Jari Kaukua gave a speech on religious tolerance in Islamic theology, Fkhr, al-Rāzī, and freedom of religious belief. Professor Kaukua is a Finnish philosopher. He's a professor at the University of Jyväskylä. I'm not sure about the pronunciation actually, as I think it's in the Finnish language. And his focus is on Arabic philosophy and theology from the 11th century onwards. In 1992, Mr. Kaukua was an Erasmus student at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. In 2001, he received his master's degree from the Faculty of Social Sciences and Philosophy at the University of Jyväskylä. Professor Dr. Kaukua received his doctorate in 2007 with the dissertation Avicenna and Subjectivity. In his main area of research is medieval philosophy, especially the Arabic philosophical and theological tradition from the 11th century CE onward. He has published mostly on questions of epistemology and philosophy of mind, but he also works on metaphysics, philosophical theology, and ethics. And we are very happy to hear your presentation there. And I'm trying to actually access the PowerPoint, and I will kind of show it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot. So I'll begin. In our time, arguments for the claim that Islam is a tolerant religion, which recognizes the intrinsic value of alternative religious beliefs, commonly appeal to certain Quranic verses. One of the most common points of reference is Quran 2:256, and this is actually on my first slide. There's no compulsion in religion. True guidance has become distinct from error. So whoever rejects false gods and believes in God has crafted the firmest handhold, one that will never break. God is all-hearing and all-knowing. Now, a typical way to interpret this verse is to read it as forbidding all coercion in general and violence in the name of Islam in particular, when it comes to another person's decision of whether to assent to the religious message revealed to Muhammad. Conversion to Islam is and must be a matter of personal choice for every mature human being in her right mind. The verse does add, of course, that there are objective criteria for distinguishing a right choice from a wrong one. But the conclusion drawn in arguments for tolerance is that a person must be guaranteed the right and the freedom to make the wrong choice. There are other ways of interpreting this material. In a study of the question of interreligious relations in the prophetic traditions, the earliest Quran commentaries and the first generations of Islamic jurisprudence, Johannan Friedman claims that from early on, the Islamic mainstream has held that Muhammad's revelation is superior to all alternatives, and that aggression in its name is therefore justified. Most interestingly, Friedman unearths early ways of reading 2:56 that are downright contrary to the moderate arguments for tolerance. Discussions concerning the context of revelation of the Quranic verses locate our verse in situations that have nothing to do with tolerance, but rather focus on the topic of exclusion from the Muslim community. Some early commentators also suggested that verses arguing for a more aggressive religious policy, such as 929 and 973, are later than 2:56 and consequently abrogate its message. What is more, even the most moderate commentators usually agree that 2:56 only refers to the so-called peoples of the book, or Christians, Jews, Sabians, and Zoroastrians, which Friedman takes to corroborate his claim that the verse does not constitute a solid piece of evidence for universal religious tolerance. Finally, Friedman also adds that the alleged Quranic message of religious tolerance is frequently compromised by legitimations of the coercion of women, children, and prisoners of war. Another sore point of the contemporary discussion of Islamic tolerance is the classical view according to which apostasy by a Muslim is sanctioned by capital punishment. Until quite recently, this view has remained largely unchallenged, even though it is difficult to find uncontroversial evidence for it in the Quran. Now, to determine the stance of a religious tradition with a long-standing literary culture to any given ethical question, one must begin by considering the question of how different answers are legitimated in the light of that culture. In the case of Islam, this question is particularly complicated because Islamic orthodoxy is not founded on any institution comparable, say, to the Catholic Church, in which creedal decisions are made centrally and in strictly defined institutional order. By contrast, the tradition of Islamic theology and interpretation of revelation is a polyphonic collection of more or less authoritative views, and this not merely in the sense of broad sectarian differences like the one between Sunnism and Shiism, but also within a single tradition that considers itself unified and is recognized as such. This does not mean that all interpretations are equal, however. In the tradition of Sunni theology, for instance, certain lines of interpretation, with their most famous representatives, emerge as the canonical standard according to which alternative views are assessed, and frequently in critical light. Given this situation, one plausible way of approaching the question of Islam's answer to a given ethical problem is to investigate what such authorities have to say on the matter and how they interpret the Quranic verses that are of relevance to the problem. Such a strategy must, of course, be informed by the understanding that no single authority has the final say on the matter, and that every author writes in a historical context, the consideration of which must guide our interpretation of the author. Consequently, every historically informed claim will necessarily be limited in scope and conditioned by its selection of sources. But this does not have to entail that our discussion is paralyzed by its inherent relativism. We just have to accept that the indecisiveness that is characteristic of most ethical debates also pertains to religious ethics. In fact, the question of authority in contemporary Islam is even more complicated. This is due to the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the wake of the colonial period and the great wars of the 20th century. Like many Protestant Christians, Muslim fundamentalists frequently adopt an explicitly critical stance towards the literary traditions of Islamic learning. The idea is that the clarity of divine revelation must not be obscured by burying it under a mass of interpretative texts accessible only to a small elite of scholars. Instead, one is to trust in the expressive power of God's word and in every literary and cognitively unimpaired adult Muslim's capacity to understand it. Although this idea has a certain democratic appeal that undermines the political power unduly attached to scholarly expertise, rejecting the intellectual tradition of the religion involves risks, many of which have unfortunately been realized in our time. Coupled with politically astute rhetoric, the straightforward interpretation of sources is a dangerous tool for condemning alternative ways of thinking as hostile towards religion as such, and thus deserving of extreme measures. This is the background for the following observations of the way in which Fkhr al-Rāzī, an important Sunni authority who flourished at the turn of the 12th and 13th centuries Common Era, interpreted the Quranic verses pertaining to religious tolerance. After a brief presentation of Rāzī's persona, I turn to discuss his interpretation of Quran 2:256. This is followed by a look at Rāzī's interpretations of related verses, as well as a brief consideration of how his approach to the Quran reflects the broad outlines of his ethical theory. Now, Fkhr al-Rāzī was born in the city of Freiheit, close to the Tehran of today, in 1149. His father, the al-Dīn Rāzī, was a theologian of the Asharite school who worked as a preacher in the town and seems to have imbued his son with the objective of reconciling between rational thought and loyalty to revealed text. Educated by his father, Rāzī was connected to a line of teachers and students that included Abu Ma'al al-Juwayni, one of the greatest authorities of the preceding generations, and Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari, the founder of the eponymous theological school himself. Of paternal inheritance is also Rāzī's commitment to the Shafi'ite school of jurisprudence, which was a rather common affiliation among later Asharite theologians. Asharite theology emerged in critical relation to the Mu'tazilite theological movement, which endorsed the independent use of natural reason in theology, and it has always emphasized the priority of the divine revelation. In their moral theory, for example, the Asharites set out from a stark rejection of Mu'tazilite moral realism. According to them, there are no values accessible to unaided human reason. In the final analysis, good and evil are subject to God's unrestrained will, and a human being can acquire a correct understanding of them only through prophetic revelation. The Asharites were not inimical to the use of reason as such, however, and the debate focused rather on the question of what human reason requires to get started on the right track. Can we proceed on our own, or do we need the foundation and the signposts of divine revelation? As a matter of fact, Asharites did not accept the uncritical endorsement of Islam's central articles of faith, or taqlid. Instead, they expected all Muslims to cultivate their understanding of religion by actively employing their reason and making use of all available knowledge, each according to her capacity. Unlike his father, Rāzī never adopted the stable position of a sedentary religious authority, but led the itinerant life of a freelance scholar. Advocating the Asharite position in critical relation to rival movements, he relocated from one court to another in the Islamic East or in the northwestern parts of contemporary Iran and in Afghanistan. In 1207, Rāzī settled in Herat, where he died as a venerated but controversial scholar in 1210. He left behind a massive corpus, including both large Summe and shorter treatises, and ranging from medicine, geometry, Arabic grammar, and Abyssinian philosophy to theology and jurisprudence. Razi's most extensive work is the central source of this paper, the great commentary on the Quran that Razi titled Mafatihul Ghaib, or the keys to what is hidden, and that he wrote towards the end of his life between 1198 and 1210. Razi's commentary tries to bring together for critical scrutiny all the strands in prior Quranic scholarship. In his preface, he takes it as his objective to find the right interpretation of faith from among the 72 sects of Islam mentioned in the prophetic traditions. Razi frequently brings forth several interpretations of individual verses, derived from Sufi authors, philosophers, theologians, jurisprudents, and experts in Arabic grammar, and the result is a rich collection of the different methods and currents in late 12th century Islamic intellectual culture. On the other hand, the systematic study of Razi's methodology shows that his aim was to interpret the Quran in the light of the best knowledge available in his time, and when required to correct the view of his time by what is expressly said in the revealed text. In the end, the commentary is a complex texture that resembles Razi's systematic works in that after all the digressions, Razi's own reflected stance is often rather difficult to pin down. Razi's commentary is an interesting focus for our study, for notwithstanding the inchoate state of post-classical Islamic intellectual history in contemporary academia, it seems undeniable that Razi had a massive impact on subsequent theology and Quranic scholarship. His works were widely used in theological education down to the 19th century, which made him a natural starting point for the first generations of Western Orientalists. Although Razi remained a controversial figure and was often harshly criticized, most notably by Taqiyuddin ibn Taymiyyah and his student Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, two of the most important historical predecessors of modern fundamentalism from the 14th century, his canonical status makes him an especially potent figure for charting the notion of religious tolerance in the mainstream of Islamic theology. Now, let's turn to Razi's interpretation of the verse 256. Razi begins his discussion of this verse by arguing that it speaks of religion in the definite form, because this concerns specifically with the religion of the one and only God, the Dinullah, or Islam. Having noted this rather obvious point, he proceeds to deal with the interpretation of the central content of the verse, pointing out that in earlier literature, the verse is frequently brought up in the discussion of three interrelated questions. First of all, the verse is related to the question raised by the first generations of Islamic theologians of whether the freedom of human will and choice is a necessary condition of our moral responsibility and our capacity to commit to the right religion. Second, the question is connected to the juridical question concerning the protected status of the so-called dhimma of Christians and Jews as subjects of Muslim rule. Third and finally, it has been employed to corroborate jurisprudential views concerning the validity of a profession of faith made in war or under warfare, or under the immediate threat of violence. Razi is of course acquainted with the long debate between the Mu'tazilites and the Ash'arites over the intimate relationship between freedom of choice and responsibility. Consequently, he begins his discussion of the first question by showing how the Mu'tazilites have appealed to Quran 2:256 to justify their position. And here I would have my first long quote. It's slide number 4. Right. So Razi writes, the first way of interpreting the verse is to say in the manner of Abu Muslim and Al-Qaffal, and according to Mu'tazilite principles. It means that he did not found the command of faith, Amr Iman, on coercion or force, but on capacity and choice. Then Al-Qaffal argued that this is also meant by saying that he has shown clear and decisive signs for his unicity. He then said that once these signs have been revealed, the non-believer has no reason to stick to unbelief, but is instead coerced and forced to believe. That, however, is not possible in this world, which is the realm of trial, for coercion to religion invalidates the trial and tribulation. Likewise, he has said, let those who believe in it do so, and let those who wish to reject it do so. In another surah, he has said, had your Lord willed, all the people on earth would have believed. So can you compel people to believe? In the surah of the poets, he has said, are you going to worry yourself to death because they will not believe? If we had wished, we could have sent them down a sign from heaven, at which their necks would stay bowed in utter humility. This claim is further corroborated by the fact that after this sentence, he says, true guidance has become distinct from error. That is, the signs are obvious and the evidence clear, and nothing remains after them but the way of forcing, oppression, and coercion. That is impossible because it invalidates obligation. This is the explanation of this interpretation. Now, the interpretation paraphrased by Rāzī here clearly stems from the question central to the Mu'tazilites concerning the close connection between human freedom and moral responsibility on the one hand and God's justice on the other. If God really is just, as he tells us in his revelation, the people subjected to his judgment must be genuinely responsible for the acts by which they are judged. Responsibility, on the other hand, presupposes the robust freedom to either commit or refrain from the acts relevant for the judgment. If people acted under coercion, either by God's direct activity or by virtue of a causal determinism that pervades the entire reality, including human agency, there would be no grounds to punish or reward them for their acts, and consequently, God's judgment could not be just. Now, the cognitive and active stance a person takes to religious revelation is the act that is the most decisive for her fate in the hereafter. If she rejects religion and refuses to act according to the law it instantiates, she is doomed to suffer eternally. But if she believes and commits to abide by the religious law, her share will be everlasting joy and pleasure. Thus, there can be no coercion to religion as stated in 256, because coercion invalidates the eschatological function of religious choice. These consequences are not the sole grounds on which the person must decide about her relationship with religion, because God has given humankind clear signs based on which the decision can be made as a matter of empirical inference. True guidance has become distinct from error, and the decision need not be made on anything like Pascal's wager. Rāzī does not specify what the signs of true guidance are, but he is most probably thinking of the idea frequent in the Quran, according to which God shows signs, as 41:53, for instance, has it, in every region of the earth and in themselves. The change of seasons, the growth of living beings, and the offspring of new generations, as well as other similar phenomena, are witness to the rational regularity of the world, which in turn is evidence for a transcendent designer. In the form of the argument from intelligent design, how could it be possible that a world this well organized did not have a rational creator? Even the Quran itself, in its marvelous design, testifies to its own truth. But what is Rāzī's own stance in this question? In my view, he shifts from a presentation of the Mu'tazilite view to its critique in a very subtle move that is easy to miss. Rāzī clearly criticizes al-Kaffar's statement that the evident signs sent down by God can be considered as a kind of coercion to religion, presumably in the sense that a rational person is forced, as it were, by the indisputable power of logical consequence to infer the monotheistic conclusion from those signs. He seems to argue that although this degree of persuasion may be possible in the hereafter, in this world, which is the realm of trial, there always remains the possibility of doubt and disbelief. And this possibility is precisely the reason why the religious decision is eschatologically meaningful. This interpretation is supported by the way in which Rāzī later specifies the interpretation by another Mu'tazila theologian, Qadi Abdul Jabbar, of the verse's crucial sentence, true guidance has become distinct from error. قَدْ تَبَيَّنَ الرُّشْدُ مِنَ الْغَيِّ. According to Abdul Jabbar, the words concern the present moment at which it is clear to anyone adequately employing her powers of reason and perception that God exists and that Islam is his religion. Rāzī, by contrast, wants to read the words as denoting the future. The distinction between true guidance and error will be evident in the eschatological phase, but in this life and under the moral trial it consists of, this cannot be the case if we want to stick to the idea that the trial is both meaningful and just. In other words, God gives human beings the sufficient capacities for making the right religious decisions on rational grounds, but in no way coerces them in one direction or another. Now, after this eschatological reading of 256, Rāzī proceeds to investigate another interpretation which focuses on more concrete matters of interpersonal religious policy, and that's the text we have in front of us now. According to another statement concerning the interpretation of the verse, coercion is a Muslim saying to an unbeliever, believe or I shall kill you. This is why he says there is no compulsion in religion when it is a question of the rights of the people of the book and of the Mazdians, for once they have accepted the tax, warfare against them ceases. When it comes to other non-believers, if they have converted to Judaism or to Christianity, the jurisprudence differ about them. Some say that the same applies to them, and in this judgment, warfare against them ceases once they have accepted the tax. According to their school, his words, "There is no compulsion in religion," holds universally of all non-believers. By contrast, other jurisprudents say that if other non-believers have converted to Judaism or Christianity, the same does not apply to them. According to them, coercion is right in their cases, and his words, "There is no compulsion," are restricted to apply only to people of the book. Assuming that the jurisprudential interpretation Rāzī presents here is compatible with the prior systematic interpretation, it is natural to think that the systematic interpretation that highlights the necessity of personal religious decision is more general than the jurisprudential interpretation. The more general theological idea can then be considered as the background of the discussion, against which the jurisprudential interpretation gives concrete instructions on how the conditions for the personal decision are to be guaranteed in concrete relations between people. The juridical interpretation thus restricts the conditions under which the personal decision is guaranteed in a society governed by Muslims. If a non-believer recognizes Muslim rule by paying the tax established in the revelation, she has a right to stick to her unbelief. According to the broader juridical interpretation, all non-believers are to be treated equally, whereas according to the narrower interpretation, only some non-believers, namely those subjects who are Jewish or Christian by birth, will be guaranteed this right, while others remain enemies by virtue of their polytheistic unbelief. Even in the narrower interpretation, one is allowed to stick to unbelief on the same grounds. The person must be allowed to decide about her personal relationship to the right religion. Thus, a narrow notion of religious tolerance is at place here as well. The third interpretation of the beginning of the verse is also concerned with a juridical question, this time concerning whether a profession of faith made in war is valid. I think this is the previous slide, probably. I think it should be slide number 6, maybe. Yes, here. So the third statement the verse is said to make is, "Do not tell one who has entered religion as a consequence of war that he has entered it coerced. For if he still gives his admission after the war, his submission is valid and he has not been coerced." This means, do not make them coerced. Likewise, he has said, "Do not say to someone who offers you a greeting of peace, 'You are not a believer,' out of desire for the chance gains of this life." Now, the question underlying this interpretation is rather easy to link with the theological idea of the freedom of religious choice. A profession of faith made under war or other immediate threat of violence is disputable, for it can be claimed to not have been made through free choice, but in an attempt to save one's life or the lives of one's associates. According to the interpretation Rāzī introduces here, however, the validity of the profession of faith made under duress can be reassessed once the situation has calmed down. If the person sticks to her profession out of her free will, the original profession can be considered valid. Hence, the theological leitmotif of the first interpretation is fully compatible with this third interpretation as well. The way in which Rāzī deals with the end of 256 is not particularly illuminating for our purpose. He spends most of his time surveying and discussing the differing views of earlier grammarians over the proper understanding of the word tahut, which denotes religious idols. Towards the end, however, he does make two observations that determine the concept of religious tolerance he has unearthed from the verse. First, he says that the belief in God, mentioned in the verse, presupposes giving up unbelief. One might think that this is self-evident, but the idea has the implicit consequence that one cannot accord other religions even the value of a potentially truthful relation to God. Likewise, the firmest handhold, one that will never break, refers exclusively to Islam and the bond between man and God that is made when one commits to Islam. Interestingly, however, Rāzī emphasizes the intellectual nature of the bond. It is a bond based on knowledge and rational persuasion. According to Rāzī, the religious choice does not only be free, but also rational. Even after the decision, the believer endowed with the requisite cognitive capacities must continue to strive for a rational conviction of the articles of faith she believes in, and in this way to deepen her understanding of them. With these thoughts, Rāzī subscribes to the classical Asharite disdain for a faith based on the imitative following of authority, or taqlid. Now, this concept of tolerance acquired from Rāzī's discussion of 256 can be complemented by investigating his comments on the verses he introduced to corroborate that verse's appeal to the necessity of personal choice. The most interesting observations are found in comments to 494 and 1099, and here on this slide is 494 in Abdul Halim's translation. So you who believe, be careful when you go to fight in God's way, and do not say to someone who offers you a greeting of peace, you are not a believer, out of desire for the chance gains of this life. God has plenty of gains for you. You yourself were in the same position once, but God was gracious to you, so be careful. God is fully aware of what you do. Classical Islamic law is practically unanimous in its absolute prohibition of the killing of a Muslim. Since the internal conflicts of early Islam, however, vigorous debate has prevailed over the criteria on which members of a hostile group can be considered as apostates or rebels against a government that is legitimate by Islamic standards and consequently legitimate objects of justified homicide. According to Rāzī, the general intent of 494 is to prevent Muslims from killing each other. Having analyzed the concepts of carefulness and entering God's way, Rāzī proceeds to discuss the crucial second sentence. Yes, precisely this sentence. He states that it refers to the submission, Islam, which God demands of Muslims, and as a consequence of which Muslims greet each other with peace, salam, in their everyday meetings. Rāzī's ethical pessimism is testified by his analysis elsewhere of this convention of greeting. In a state of nature, people are in a potential or in actual conflict with each other, and only commitment to the law and the moral code stated in divine revelation can render peaceful the internal. Greeting of peace signals rejection of the state of nature and its inherent aggression, as well as commitment to the set of norms that provides the foundation for the community.
Jetzt wollte ich wissen, ob es reicht, dass ich den Vordruck ausfülle und meine Verdienstbescheinigung dazu packe in Kopie und einfach ans Stadtamt schicke.
Now, the special message of 494 seems to concern the question of how to act in situations in which a person formerly considered as an enemy suddenly approaches a Muslim with a greeting of peace. At the very least, one ought not reject the greeting as invalid out of a selfish desire for the gains of this life, such as the confiscation of the other person's property. The verse seems to say that one should instead investigate with care and proper scrutiny the person's underlying motives and find out about the genuineness of the conversion signaled by the greeting. In this regard, Rāzī tells us that jurisprudence has presented several arguments for the view that the verse's encouragement to withhold from aggression also pertains to greetings of peace made by non-believers. He also briefly discusses other juridical debates related to our topic, such as the questions of whether professions of faith made by minors can be considered valid, and whether Christians and Jews are genuinely committed to the doctrine of a single God. In the latter context, he makes the interesting observation that the professions of faith made by Christians and Jews are invalid because they entail the idea that Muhammad's creed is culturally specific. When they deny that the specificities of the Islamic religion concern them on the grounds that Islamic revelation is directed exclusively at Arabs, Christians and Jews deny the source of the revelation by consequence. Although Rāzī is not quite explicit about this, his juridical conclusion seems to be that the absolute denial of aggression towards Muslims does not pertain to other peoples of the book. Especially interesting for our topic is Rāzī's treatment of the sentence, "You yourself were in the same position, but God was gracious to you." Relying on earlier commentators, he claims that the sentence refers to possible deficiencies in the initial greetings of peace made by Muslims themselves. The idea is to set the standards of religious conversion signaled by the non-believer's greeting of peace as low as possible. A Muslim should interpret every greeting of peace as charitably as possible and to assume that the underlying intention is sincere. To put this another way, one must not be prone to doubt that a new convert has merely uttered the words of the profession of faith without sufficient understanding and commitment, or as the verse tells us, the same skeptical critique could have been directed at a Muslim who was committed to Islam earlier and is now firm in her faith and understanding. By the same token, a profession of faith made under a threat of violence is not automatically invalid, as we noticed in the earlier discussion of Quran 2:256. With all this, Rāzī seems to be thinking of a psychological theory of how a profession of faith that is initially made on the level of mere speech is interiorized over time and thus becomes genuine faith. And this would be slide number 13, my next text. Oh, exactly this one. In my view, it is most appropriate to say that when changing from one religion to another, there is at first only a small disposition by virtue of some weak cause. That disposition then constantly grows and strengthens until it becomes complete and begins to dominate, and the change takes place. It is as if the verse said to Muslims, "This is what you were like in the beginning, when a weak disposition to submit was aroused in you by virtue of some weak causes. And then, as that disposition grew stronger and your repugnance towards unbelief increased, God made submission your share. Likewise, a weak disposition for submission has arisen in them by virtue of this fear, and they have committed to this faith. God has increased the sweetness of faith in their hearts and strengthened that desire in their breasts." This is what the verse is about, in my opinion. In this passage, Rāzī is exceptionally explicit about his personal stance. One must not downplay a profession of faith due to its potentially deficient motives, because the gradual strengthening of the decision is part of the nature of religious conversion. The initial impetus may even be provided by morally questionable causes, such as the mere desire to flee from oppression. What is crucial is how the initial disposition develops in the person's subsequent thought and activity. Now, how does this go together with the personal decision emphasized in Rāzī's interpretation of 256? At the very least, it seems clear that the personal choice does not have to be the result of any exceptionally long deliberation or internal investigation, or soul searching, if you like. More important than the events leading to the initial conversion is the process that follows. The person's commitment and the consequent eschatological fate is decided by how she cultivates her relation to the central content of the decision, how she develops her understanding of God and of his revelation, and how well she abides in her agency by the law and moral norm revealed by God. On the other hand, Rāzī's interpretation emphasizes God's role in the initial disposition's development to genuine faith. Islam comes to be the share of believers from God. It is God who made submission your share, and it is God who increases the sweetness of faith and the concomitant desire. This seems to be in tension with the requirement of personal decision, as becomes clear from Rāzī's comments to Quran 1099. Quran 1099, which is here, reads quite easily as an expression of the aforementioned tension. It says, "Had your Lord willed, all the people on earth would have believed. So can you compel people to believe?" In this verse, God addresses Muhammad directly, saying that the Prophet lacks the power over people's personal decisions concerning faith. He can transmit the revealed message and try to convince his audience of its truth by means of his own example and teaching, but that is all. There is no coercion in religion because no human being can produce beliefs in another. By contrast, it is under the power of God to generate faith in human beings by his voluntary choice. Rāzī links his discussion of the verse to the debate, by this time centuries old, between the Mu'tazilites and the Ash'arites over the nature of human action. If God is omnipotent, who is the ultimate agent of human acts, after all? If human beings are the agents of their own acts, as the Mu'tazilites thought, and as seems intuitively plausible based on human moral responsibility, then the domain of human acts restricts God's omnipotence. By contrast, if God is absolutely omnipotent and the ultimate cause of everything, including human acts, as the Ash'arites traditionally held, it remains unclear on what grounds people remain morally responsible for their acts. Consequently, how can God's delivery of rewards and punishments on the Last Judgment ever be just if he is the ultimate agent of both sinful and virtuous acts? In his explanation of 1099, Rāzī immediately reveals his Ash'arite sympathies, and this would be slide number 16. He writes, "Our associates have argued for the validity of their claim that all that exists is of the will of God. They say that if the non-existence of something is caused by the non-existence of something else, then his words, 'Had your Lord willed, all the people on earth would have believed,' entail that had this will not emerged, no faith whatsoever would have emerged among the people of the earth. This in turn shows that he has not willed everyone to believe." The Ash'arite argument is based on a consequence of what we could call the principle of sufficient reason. If there are genuine causal relations between things, then a thing is necessarily brought about once the sufficient causes for its being brought about obtain. When a pine seed is in fertile soil and sufficient light, warmth, and water are available, the tree eventually comes about as a necessary consequence. If something is not brought about, then the same principle allows us to conclude that the necessary and sufficient causes of that thing have not been brought about either. If the seed is in the soil, but there is no tree, we can be certain that either the soil is not sufficiently rich in nutrients, or the plant has not been exposed to sufficient light, warmth, and water. Now, the verse under consideration makes the claim that God's will is the sufficient cause of human faith, without taking an explicit stand over whether faith can have other sufficient causes, though. It is an evident empirical fact, however, that not everyone has faith. Based on the principle of sufficient reason and the present verse, we can thus conclude that God has not willed everyone to believe. Rāzī then notes that Mu'tazila theologians who emphasize the individual responsibility have presented an alternative interpretation of the verse. This would be slide number 17. Al-Jubai, al-Qadi, and others have replied that what is meant here is the will to coerce. In other words, if God willed to coerce them to believe, he would have the power over this, and it would be possible for him, but he will not do it because a faith that has emerged in a servant through coercion is of no use to him and has no value. Thereafter, Al-Jubai said that God coerces them to this means that he knows them, and that if they try to resign from this, he will necessarily interfere between them and the resignation. In this sense, there is no doubt over whether they will do what they are coerced to do. If one is known to have tried to murder the king, but to have been prevented by force, his resignation from that act is no cause for his desert of praise and reward. The same applies here. End of quote. The Mu'tazilite objection is clear and well in line with their interpretation of 2.256 discussed above. God could have willed to coerce people to believe, but he has not done so because coerced faith would be of no value. God does, of course, want everyone to believe, but only out of a freely performed decision. Al-Jubai's additional argument is not quite as clear, but apparently the question concerns the connection God has established between religious choice and its consequences. What we cannot resign from are the consequences of our choice. No person is coerced to make a specific choice, but once the choice has been made, she cannot resign from it or its consequences. Again, underlying this is the Mu'tazilite emphasis on God's justice. For God to be just, all human acts must be free and they must have certain consequences. Rāzī responds with an analysis of the capacities presupposed by religious choice, and this would be the next slide. He writes, the unbeliever has the power to be in unbelief, but does he have the power to believe, or does he lack this power? If he has the power to be in unbelief, but no power to believe, then the power to be in unbelief entails unbelief. Because the creator of that power is God, it follows that we must say that God has created the power that entails unbelief. Consequently, we must say that he has willed the unbeliever to be in unbelief. If, on the other hand, the unbeliever's power enables either of the two opposites, as people tend to think, then where one of the opposites realized not by virtue of some preponderating factor, the realization would take place without a preponderating factor, which is evidently untrue. By contrast, if it takes place by virtue of some preponderating factor, that preponderating factor will either come from the servant or from God. If it comes from the servant, the analysis returns to him, which results in a circle, and that is impossible. If it comes from God, then the power and the cause together necessarily entail unbelief, and because the creator of both the power and the cause is God, the entailment is eventually traced back to him. So let us suppose that a person really did have the power to freely choose between faith and unbelief. For the choice to be understandable, it must be based on reason. An entirely arbitrary choice is ultimately incomprehensible. We cannot find any ultimate reason for the choice in the human being herself, because once we have ruled out voluntary choice not based on reasons, we can always ask for a new reason. This either leads to the vicious circle that Rāzī mentions in his response, or to an equally impossible infinite regress of reasons. Hence, the reason must come from without the human being, and in the final analysis, from the cause of all causes, God. Since God has created both the reason and the capacity for decision that is determined by that reason, that is to say, the sufficient cause for the decision, we must conclude that he has created the unbeliever's decision to remain in unbelief. Of course, the same applies to the decision to commit to the right faith. The capacity to decide and the reasons for the decision are equally the work of God. The outcome is that the Mu'tazilite stance is inconsistent. From a philosophical point of view, Rāzī's comments leave the debate inherited from his predecessors to a stalemate. His arguments are only capable of pointing out problems in the Mu'tazilite theory that emphasizes human freedom, and he does not even attempt to mitigate the Ash'arite theory's inherent tension between God's omnipotence and justice. While this would be frustrating for an investigation concerning the questions of debate over theory of action, God's active role may be quite crucial to the concept of religious tolerance. So I conclude. Notwithstanding the sketchiness of the foregoing, I believe that the observations we have made allow us to delineate a systematically grounded concept of religious tolerance. The point of departure is the originally Mu'tazilite view, articulated by al-Razi in the context of 2256, that only a freely made personal choice can provide the basis for a genuine religious commitment. We must take a tolerant stance to people's individual religious choices, because this life can fulfill its fundamental purpose as a place of religious and moral trial only if no one is coerced to make any religious choice. The possibility of failing and being wrong, that is a necessary condition of the trial, must thus be safeguarded, and in this sense all religious beliefs are inherently valuable, even though only one religion is right and true. On the other hand, people do not make their choices in a vacuum, but as the consequence of a variety of influences and motives that provide the required impetus. Razi's comments to 494 show that he does not hold these motives, which can be quite questionable from the point of view of the moral value of the religious decision, to be aggravations in the assessment of others' beliefs. On the contrary, the real trial for the stability and the inherent nature of a religious choice is whether the person remains committed to her decision and cultivates her faith over the entire course of her life. The reward or punishment in the hereafter is not a consequence of a single one-time decision. Instead, the decision makes a person conscious of the nature of life as a trial, and it gives a new meaning to all her thought and action after the decision. The natural conclusion from all this is that Muslims should take their neighbors' religious expression sincere by default and concentrate all their critical powers to the cultivation of their own faith. What about the debate concerning the ultimate agent behind the religious decision then? The problems concerning theory of action notwithstanding, one could say that Razi's Asharite idea of divine agency underlying people's religious decisions actually supports the demand of tolerance in religious questions between human beings. If God is the ultimate cause underlying a person's beliefs, the right to freely commit to beliefs is ultimately a right that belongs to him, something we could call haqqullah. So in other words, people should leave each other's religious decisions to God. And on this note, I will end, and I want to thank you all for your kind attention.